The most dangerous man in New York City made his decision in 3 seconds, the same amount of time it took for Michelle Miller's sleeve to slip and reveal the unmistakable bruises circling her wrist. Rodrigo Savino saw them. Michelle saw him see them. And in that crystallized moment of silent recognition, both knew that someone was about to die. Welcome back, my beautiful family and friends. If you're ready for another captivating story, go ahead and click subscribe, like this video, and tell me in the comments where in the world you're watching from. I love knowing how far our stories travel and how many hearts they reach. Your support helps us bring even more thrilling tales your way, and trust me, you won't want to miss what's coming next. Now, settle in. Let's begin the story. Michelle's pulse hammered as she tried to tug her uniform sleeve back down, her mind racing with excuses she'd perfected over 8 months of hiding Travis's violence. Just say it was the kitchen door. Say you're clumsy. Say anything. But across the white tablecloth, Rodrigo Savino was no longer listening to excuses. His mind had already moved past conversation into calculation, the kind of cold, methodical planning that had built his empire and buried his enemies. He'd seen bruises like these before, on his mother, 15 years ago, right before she stopped breathing. This one won't end the same way, he thought, his jaw tightening imperceptibly. Not again. Michelle forced her practiced smile, the one that said everything's fine, even as her ribs ached from where Travis had shoved her against the counter last night. She didn't know that the man before her was already 3 steps ahead, already knowing Travis's full name, his address, and exactly which of his men would handle this quietly. "Can I get you anything else, Mr. Savino?" Her voice came out steadier than she felt, a small victory she'd learned to celebrate. Rodrigo studied her with the same intensity he used to assess threats and territories. She was 28, 7 months pregnant, and carrying weight that had nothing to do with the child. Her eyes held the exhaustion of someone who'd stopped expecting rescue. That look, that hollow resignation, ignited something in him that power and money had never touched. She thinks she's alone, he realized. She has no idea she just became the most protected woman in this city. Who did this? His voice was quiet, but Michelle heard the danger beneath it. So did every person within earshot, though they pretended to focus on their meals. She wanted to lie. Lying had kept her safe, or at least alive. But something in Rodrigo's dark eyes told her he already knew the answer. He was simply giving her the dignity of truth. "My boyfriend." The words escaped before she could stop them. He didn't mean it was an accident. Rodrigo's expression didn't change, but inside, his decision solidified into something irreversible. Travis wasn't just a problem anymore. He was an insult. A violation of something Rodrigo had sworn on his mother's grave, in the aftermath of his father's violence, would never happen again under his watch. He reached into his jacket, pulled out a card with only a phone number, and placed it between them like a contract. "When you're ready," he said, standing slowly. "Call me." Michelle stared at the card, terrified and confused. She didn't understand what was happening. But Rodrigo did. And 48 hours from now, so would Travis in the last 3 seconds of his life. The ghost of Rodrigo's mother haunted more than his memories. She shaped every decision he made in the hours that followed. While Michelle clutched that business card in her small apartment, he sat in his penthouse overlooking the East River, a manila folder spread across his desk like an autopsy report. Travis Michael Hall, age 31, small-time gambler, big-time debts. His lieutenant Marco stood by the window. He's connected to the Carleones, owes them $43,000, uses the girlfriend as collateral, keeps her working to pay it off. Rodrigo's fingers stilled on the paper. Collateral. The word tasted like poison. Marco continued, oblivious to the shift in temperature. Word is he's been shopping her around as leverage. Told Carleone's guys if they want their money, they can rent her out after the baby comes. The glass in Rodrigo's hand shattered. Across the city, Michelle pressed an ice pack against her cheek, where Travis's ring had split the skin. The apartment was dark except for the flickering television. Travis passed out on the couch, beer cans forming a pyramid beside him. She whispered to her belly, her voice breaking. "I'm sorry. I'm so sorry you're coming into this." The baby kicked. Michelle closed her eyes. "When you're ready, call me." She'd thrown the card away twice, retrieved it both times. Now it sat in her apron pocket, edges worn from nervous fingers. She didn't know what calling that number meant. Didn't know if salvation could come from a man whose name made grown men flinch. But she knew Travis, knew the debts were growing, knew the violence would too. 3 more weeks until delivery. Then what? The television flickered. A news report, another suspicious fire in Carleone territory. Michelle looked at the card again. 2 nights later, Rodrigo returned to La Bella Notte. Michelle's hands trembled so badly she nearly dropped the wine tray when she saw him. He sat at the same table, same time, as if orchestrating the moment. Mr. Savino. Her voice barely qualified as a whisper. Your usual? Sit. It wasn't a request. Michelle glanced toward the kitchen, then back at him. Slowly, she lowered herself into the chair across from him, belly pressing against the table edge. The restaurant buzzed around them, but their table existed in a pocket of silence. Rodrigo leaned forward. You're safe here. The words were simple. The tone was final. Michelle's throat tightened. I know about Travis. I know about the Carleones. I know what he promised them. His eyes held hers with an intensity that made her forget to breathe. That ends now. You can't just... I already did. Michelle felt the ground shift beneath her. This wasn't comfort. This wasn't rescue. This was something else entirely, something that operated in shadows and left no paper trail. What did you do? She whispered. Rodrigo stood, adjusting his cufflinks. Gave you a choice you didn't have yesterday. He walked toward the exit, then paused. The card, Michelle. Use it or don't. But know this. His voice dropped to something almost gentle. You're under my protection now, whether you want it or not. The door closed behind him. Michelle sat frozen, one hand on her belly, the other clutching the card that suddenly felt less like paper and more like a key to a cage she couldn't see yet. Outside, Rodrigo's car idled. Marco sat in the driver's seat. Travis? Being collected as we speak. Rodrigo's jaw set. No one touches her again. The restaurant had emptied an hour ago, but Rodrigo Savino remained. He sat in shadow near the bar, watching Michelle move through the closing routine she'd perfected through exhaustion, wiping tables, stacking chairs, her movements slow and heavy. She sensed him before she saw him. The air shifted the way it always did when he was near, charged with something she couldn't name. Outside, Marco sat in the idling Mercedes, phone pressed to his ear. Travis Hall's location confirmed. Apartment 4C, 9th Avenue. He's alone. Drunk. A pause. Waiting on your word, boss. Inside, Michelle's hands trembled as she folded the last napkin. She knew Rodrigo was still there. Knew he was waiting. Part of her wanted to run. The other part, the part exhausted from running, wanted to collapse. Tell me his name. His voice cut through the silence like a blade through silk. Michelle's composure, already threadbare, began to unravel. She kept her back to him, gripping the table edge. I already told you. His full name, where he lives, everything. The question wasn't a request. It was a scalpel, precisely placed to open the wound she'd spent months covering. Her breathing quickened. Why? What are you going to? Michelle. He stood, his footsteps deliberate as he crossed the dining room. Tell me. And something inside her broke. The tears came first silent, then convulsive. Her legs gave out, and she sank into a chair, one hand pressed against her belly as if shielding her child from the truth she was about to speak aloud. Travis Hall, she whispered. 9th Avenue, apartment 4C. Rodrigo's expression didn't change, but inside, something ancient and violent awakened. He'd known the address for 2 days. Hearing her say it, hearing the defeat in her voice, transformed information into verdict. Michelle's words spilled out now, uncontrollable. He takes my tips, every night. Says I owe him for letting me work. When I'm late, her voice cracked. Last week he said after the baby comes, he's taking her. Said I'm too stupid to raise a kid, that he'll sell her if I try to leave. Rodrigo's silence was colder than winter, more terrifying than rage. He'd heard confessions before, from men begging for their lives, from rivals negotiating surrender. But this? A pregnant woman detailing how she'd been dismantled piece by piece by a man who should have protected her? This was different. This was personal. Michelle looked up, tears streaming. I know you can't help. I know it's not your problem. I needed to tell someone before I... Rodrigo moved. In 3 strides he was beside her, removing his coat and draping it over her shoulders. The weight of it, expensive cashmere, still warm from his body, felt like armor she didn't deserve. You don't go home tonight. The words were final. No negotiation, no discussion. Michelle's eyes widened. I have to. If I don't, he'll what? Rodrigo's voice was soft, deadly. Come looking for you? I'm counting on it. Outside, Marco's phone buzzed. A single text. Now. Rodrigo guided Michelle toward the back exit where the black Mercedes waited, engine purring. She moved like a sleepwalker, caught between terror and disbelief. Where are we going? Somewhere safe. He opened the car door. Somewhere he'll never find you. As Michelle slid into the leather interior, Rodrigo's phone lit up with a message from his second-in-command. Target acquired. Awaiting instructions. Rodrigo typed back. Bring him to the warehouse. Alive. I want to ask him some questions. He climbed in beside Michelle, closing the door on the life she knew. Across town, 3 men in dark clothing entered a rundown building on 9th Avenue. Travis Hall was about to learn that some debts aren't paid in money. They're paid in blood. And Rodrigo Savino always collected. Travis Hall's last coherent thought was that someone was knocking too loudly. He stumbled to the door of apartment 4C at 2:47 a.m., drunk and irritated, expecting a neighbor complaining about the television volume. Instead, 3 men in black stood in the hallway, their faces professionally blank. Travis Hall? Who's asking? The answer came in the form of a cloth pressed over his mouth. He struggled for 4 seconds. Then darkness. By 3:15 a.m., the apartment was empty. By dawn, it was as if Travis Hall had simply evaporated from existence. 2 nights later, Detective Sarah Chen stood in that same apartment, notepad in hand, staring at a scene that told her absolutely nothing. No signs of struggle. No blood. Travis's wallet and phone sat on the counter. His car remained parked outside. Domestic disturbance? Her partner offered, scanning the police report filed by a downstairs neighbor who'd heard raised voices a week prior. Chen's jaw tightened. She'd worked organized crime for 6 years. She knew a professional extraction when she saw one. Listed as unresolved. Missing person, probable foul play. You think it's... I don't think anything. She cut him off. And neither do you. Because in this city, some cases close themselves. And names like Savino didn't appear in official reports unless you wanted your career to disappear too. The whispers started in the restaurant kitchens, the back alleys, the places where the city's underbelly breathed. Did you hear? That waitress's boyfriend. Vanished. Just gone. Savino's got a new interest, they say. Never mess with what belongs to him. At La Bella Notte, the staff walked quieter, spoke softer. Michelle's name became something whispered with reverence and fear. She didn't understand why veteran servers now deferred to her, why the manager gave her the best shifts without asking. She only understood one thing. Travis was gone. Michelle had been staying in the penthouse suite above Savino's hotel for 3 days when the reality solidified. She'd called Travis's phone 47 times. Each call went straight to voicemail. She'd checked their apartment. The landlord said he hadn't seen him in days. He just left, she told herself, hands trembling as she poured tea. He finally just left. But the bruises on her wrist told a different story. Men like Travis didn't leave. They escalated. They punished. They controlled until there was nothing left to control. Unless someone made them stop. Michelle looked out over the Manhattan skyline, one hand on her belly. Her daughter kicked and she whispered, "We're safe now. I think we're safe." She wanted to believe it. But safety purchased with blood had a price she wasn't sure she could afford. When Rodrigo returned to La Bella Notte a week later, Michelle was behind the bar, inventory clipboard in hand. Management had promoted her. Mr. Savino's suggestion, they'd said, voices careful and respectful. She saw him enter and her breath caught. Part relief, part terror, part something she didn't have words for yet. He crossed the empty restaurant during the pre-dinner lull, his presence commanding even in silence. Michelle set down her clipboard, pulse racing. "I need to know something," Rodrigo said quietly, stopping at the bar between them. Michelle's throat tightened. "Don't ask. Please don't make me say it. Did he ever hit you when you were carrying the child?" The question landed like a physical blow. Michelle's eyes filled with tears she refused to let fall. Her hand moved instinctively to her belly. Protective, ashamed. She couldn't speak, couldn't lie, couldn't admit the truth she'd hidden even from herself. Her silence was answer enough. Rodrigo's expression didn't change, but something in his eyes turned to stone. He reached across the bar, his hand covering hers, gentle, deliberate, a promise written in touch. "He won't again," he said. The words were simple, but Michelle heard both meanings layered beneath them. He won't hurt you again, and he won't do anything again. Promise and sentence, delivered in the same breath. She should have been horrified, should have demanded answers, called the police, run from the man who just confirmed her darkest suspicion. Instead, she felt her daughter kick, felt the absence of fear for the first time in months, and understood that justice didn't always wear a badge. Sometimes it wore a black suit and offered protection that came at a price the guilty had already paid. Rodrigo squeezed her hand once, then released it. "You're safe now, Michelle, I promise you that." He walked toward the exit, leaving her standing in the amber light of La Bella Notte, finally understanding that the most dangerous man in New York City had just become her salvation. Outside, Marco waited in the Mercedes. "The warehouse?" "Clean it," Rodrigo said simply. "Thoroughly." Some debts were paid in silence, and Travis Halls had been settled in full. The penthouse suite occupied the entire 23rd floor of the Savino Hotel on Park Avenue. Floor-to-ceiling windows framed Manhattan like a photograph, all steel and glass and impossible light. Michelle stood at those windows her first morning there, one hand pressed against the glass, unable to reconcile the view with the peeling wallpaper and broken radiator she'd left behind. "Just until things calm down," Rodrigo had said when he'd brought her here 3 days ago. But Michelle was beginning to understand that when Rodrigo Savino moved you into his world, you didn't leave until he decided things were calm, and perhaps not even then. A knock at the door made her turn. Rodrigo entered carrying bags from a nearby Italian bakery, his usual black suit replaced by a simple white shirt, sleeves rolled to reveal the tattoos that climbed his forearms like a map of violence and consequence. "You ate yesterday?" he asked, setting the bags on the marble counter. "I'm not a child." That wasn't the question. Michelle's defenses faltered. "Toast, I think." His jaw tightened. That particular look she'd learned meant he was fighting the urge to control something he couldn't control. "Sit." This became their routine. Every morning at 8, Rodrigo arrived with breakfast. Pastries, fruit, protein. The baby needs it, he'd insist. Though Michelle suspected it was less about nutrition and more about the need to ensure she existed, that she was real, that history wasn't repeating itself in some cruel cycle he couldn't break. He'd stay for an hour. Sometimes they talked. More often, they sat in comfortable silence while Michelle ate, and Rodrigo answered calls in clipped Italian, conducting business from her breakfast table as if it were the most natural thing in the world. "Why are you doing this?" she asked one morning, watching him review contracts on his phone. He didn't look up. "Doing what?" "All of this. I'm nobody. I was just a waitress. You were never just anything." His eyes met hers, dark and certain. "And you're under my protection now. That means something." Michelle wanted to ask what it meant. Wanted to ask what happened to Travis, what price she'd unknowingly agreed to pay. But part of her already knew, and part of her was grateful she didn't have to say it aloud. What Michelle didn't know was that protecting her had become Rodrigo's obsession in ways that went beyond duty or code. At night, alone in his own penthouse across town, he stared at photos of his mother, the ones from before, when she still smiled, before his father's fists had stolen the light from her eyes. She died when Rodrigo was 21, officially from a fall down the stairs, unofficially from years of violence that had broken more than bones. He'd been too young to stop it, too powerless within his father's empire to intervene. Never again, he'd sworn at her grave. And now, watching Michelle laugh at something ridiculous on television, watching her unconsciously rest a hand on her belly in that protective gesture all mothers shared, he saw his second chance. His redemption written in someone else's salvation. If he could save her, maybe his mother's death meant something. Maybe the empire built on blood could protect something innocent for once. In the streets below, different conversations were taking place. Vincent Carleone sat in the back of a social club in Little Italy, cigar smoke curling around his weathered face. "You're telling me Savino's gone soft over a pregnant waitress?" His lieutenant nodded. "Has her in the Park Avenue property. Visits every day. Word is he disappeared her boyfriend for putting hands on her." Vincent smiled, the kind of smile that preceded violence. A weakness. After all these years, the great Rodrigo Savino finally has a weakness. "What do you want us to do?" "Watch her. Learn her routine. We don't move yet. Let him get comfortable. Let him think his little sanctuary is untouchable." Vincent tapped ash from his cigar. "Then we remind him that in this city nothing stays protected forever." Across the table, men nodded. Plans began forming in the smoke-filled room, plans that would test exactly how far Rodrigo Savino would go to protect what was his. That evening, Rodrigo stood at Michelle's window, watching the city lights flicker to life. She was asleep on the couch, exhausted from pregnancy and the weight of safety she wasn't used to carrying. He didn't know yet that enemies were circling, didn't know that his protection had painted a target on her back. But he would learn. And when he did, the city would remember why the Savino name was whispered in fear. The photograph arrived at Vincent Carleone's social club on a Tuesday afternoon. Michelle Miller, 7 months pregnant, entering the Savino Hotel on Park Avenue. Her face was clear, her vulnerability obvious. Vincent studied it like a general reviewing battlefield terrain. The great Rodrigo Savino, he mused, smoke curling from his cigar. Brought to his knees by a waitress carrying another man's bastard. His nephew, Tony, leaned forward. We could grab her, use her as... No. Vincent's tone was sharp. We test first. See how far his protection extends. Send a message. Let him know his little sanctuary has cracks. Tony grinned. What kind of message? The kind that wakes him up at 3 a.m. wondering if he's fast enough to keep her breathing. The attempt came on a Thursday night. Michelle was asleep when the lock on her suite door began to turn. Not picked, but bypassed with a keycard that should never have existed outside Rodrigo's inner circle. Someone had been bought. Someone had talked. The door opened 6 inches before the hotel's head of security, a former Marine named Davis who'd served in Rodrigo's organization for a decade, stepped into the hallway and put a bullet through the intruder's kneecap. The scream woke Michelle. By the time she reached the living room, heart hammering, Davis was on his phone. Sir, we had a breach. Suite is secure. Target neutralized. Michelle stood frozen in her nightgown, staring at the blood trail in the hallway where someone had been dragged away. Her hands instinctively covered her belly. They came for me. Someone came for me. Davis turned, his expression professionally blank. Ma'am, Mr. Savino is on his way. You're safe. But Michelle didn't feel safe. She felt like prey. Rodrigo arrived within 7 minutes, still wearing yesterday's clothes, his eyes wild with something that looked like barely controlled violence. He crossed to Michelle in 3 strides, hands cupping her face, checking for injuries she didn't have. Did they touch you? No, Davis stopped them before. Who sent them? Rodrigo turned to Davis, his voice dropping to something deadly. Carleone crew. The one who's still breathing is downstairs, waiting for you. Something in Rodrigo's expression shifted, not anger, but something colder. Something Michelle had never seen directed at anyone but sensed, had always been lurking beneath his careful control. He kissed her forehead, a gesture so gentle it contradicted everything his eyes promised. Stay here. Lock the door. I'll handle this. Handle what? But he was already gone. What happened in the basement of the Savino Hotel would never appear in official reports. The intruder would later be found in the East River with his tongue removed, a message to anyone who'd considered talking about what he'd seen. But what happened above ground made headlines. By dawn, 3 Carleone fronts were reduced to ash. A restaurant in Little Italy, flames visible from Brooklyn. A gambling den in Queens, explosion blamed on faulty gas lines. A social club in the Bronx, electrical fire, they said, though the building had been renovated 6 months prior. The morning news called it a series of coincidental fires under investigation. The underworld knew better. They knew Rodrigo Savino's signature when they saw it. Swift, brutal, impossible to prove, and absolutely devastating. Michelle read the news on her tablet, coffee growing cold in her hands. 3 fires. No casualties reported, but buildings destroyed. Businesses erased overnight. All in neighborhoods she'd heard whispered about, all connected to the Carleone name. When Rodrigo arrived that afternoon with lunch, she was waiting. 3 fires, she said quietly. 3 buildings, all in one night. He set the food down, his expression unreadable. Yes, because of me. Because someone tried to hurt you. Michelle's voice shook. You said I was safe. Rodrigo moved closer, his presence filling the space between them. You are. At what cost? Her hand gestured toward the tablet, the news coverage, the destruction. How many people were warned? He interrupted, his tone absolute. Every building was empty. Every person connected was given a choice, back off or burn. They chose poorly. Michelle stared at him, horror and gratitude warring in her chest. He'd destroyed 3 buildings to protect her, had sent a message written in fire and ash that said she was untouchable. This isn't normal, she whispered. This isn't. Safety costs blood, Michelle. His voice was soft but immovable. It costs fear. It costs making sure your enemies understand that touching you means war. That's what protection looks like in my world. She should have been terrified, should have run. Instead, she felt her daughter kick and understood that sometimes monsters protected you from other monsters, and sometimes that was the only safety available. No more fires, she said finally. Rodrigo's smile was grim. I can't promise that. Then promise me truth. No more lies about what you do to keep me safe. He studied her for a long moment, then nodded. Truth. Always. Outside, the city whispered Rodrigo Savino's name with renewed fear. Inside, Michelle learned that Sanctuary had teeth. The silence between them had weight. For 3 days after the fires, Michelle moved through the penthouse suite like a ghost, and Rodrigo watched her from careful distances, sensing the question building in her like pressure before a storm. He knew what she needed to ask, knew what he'd have to answer. The truth had a way of demanding air eventually. It came on a Sunday evening. Rain streaked the windows, turning Manhattan into a blur of light and shadow. Rodrigo arrived with dinner as usual, but Michelle didn't move from where she stood at the window, her reflection pale against the darkening sky. I need to know about Travis. Her voice was quiet, but it cut through the apartment like a confession. Rodrigo set the bags down slowly, his pulse steady even as something in his chest tightened. He'd known this moment would come, had prepared for it the way he prepared for war, by accepting that some battles couldn't be avoided, only survived. What do you want to know? Michelle turned. Her eyes were red-rimmed, but her voice was steel. Everything. No more careful words, no more protection from the truth. What happened to him? Rodrigo studied her 7 months pregnant, standing in his sanctuary, demanding honesty that might destroy whatever fragile thing was building between them. She deserved the truth. Deserved to choose what happened next with full knowledge of what he'd done. My men found him 2 hours after you told me his name, Rodrigo said, his tone neither apologetic nor proud, simply factual. We brought him to a warehouse in Red Hook. Michelle's breath caught, but she didn't look away. Rodrigo continued, knowing that mercy now would be a different kind of cruelty. I asked him questions. About the debts. About the Carleones. About what he planned to do with your daughter after she was born. His voice hardened. He laughed. Said you were too weak to stop him. That the baby would fetch a good price if he needed quick cash. Michelle's hand moved to her belly, protective and trembling. He laid hands on you, Rodrigo said quietly. Bruised you while you carried a child. That was enough. Enough for what? Michelle's voice cracked. Say it. Stop dancing around it, and just, I killed him. The words landed between them like stones in still water. Michelle's legs weakened. She grabbed the window frame for support, her mind reeling between the relief she felt and the horror she knew she should feel. You how? Does it matter? Yes. Her voice was fierce now, demanding. If I'm going to live with this, if I'm going to accept what you did in my name, I need to know. Rodrigo moved closer, his presence steady even as he delivered truth that could break her. Quickly. He didn't suffer. That was more mercy than he deserved, but I didn't do it for him. I did it so you wouldn't carry the weight of his suffering. Michelle's tears came then not for Travis, but for the impossibility of what she felt. Gratitude and grief, relief and guilt. The freedom of knowing he'd never hurt her again, tangled with the knowledge of what that freedom had cost. You killed him, she whispered again, as if saying it enough times would make it real. I ended what hurt you. Rodrigo corrected, his voice soft but absolute. There's a difference. Is there? Michelle looked up at him, searching his face for something remorse, justification, humanity. You took a life. I saved one. He gestured toward her belly. Yours. Hers. The life you would have lived in fear. I took one to protect too. That's the math I live by. Michelle trembled, torn between the woman she'd been raised, to be the one who believed in law and order and justice served through proper channels, and the woman she'd become through violence and fear. That old version of herself would have called the police, would have been horrified. But that version had also let Travis hurt her for 8 months because the system had failed her at every turn. You're a monster, she said, testing the words. To some. Rodrigo didn't flinch. To you, I hope I'm something else. And there it was, the duality that had been building since the moment he'd first seen her bruises. Michelle saw it clearly now. The man who destroyed buildings and erased enemies was the same man who brought her breakfast and made sure she laughed. The hands that had ended Travis's life were the same hands that had covered hers with gentle promise. Monster and savior, wrapped in expensive suits and tattoos that told stories of violence in service of something he considered sacred, protection. I should hate you, Michelle whispered. You should, Rodrigo agreed. But do you? She wanted to say yes, wanted to maintain the moral high ground, to be the woman who rejected violence even in her own defense. But her daughter kicked, and Michelle realized that sometimes justice didn't arrive with badges and courtrooms. Sometimes it wore a black suit and carried the weight of promises kept in blood. No, she admitted finally. God help me, I don't. Rodrigo exhaled, not quite relief, but something close. Then we move forward, together, in truth. Outside, the rain continued to fall on a city that would never know the full story. Inside, Michel accepted the protection of a monster and found salvation in his shadows. The dismantling of the Carleone family took 72 hours. On Monday, Vincent Carleone's nephew Tony was found in the Hudson, hands bound, a single bullet wound that spoke of execution rather than accident. The message was clear. The old rules no longer applied. On Tuesday, federal raids swept through Carleone businesses, anonymous tips delivered with documentation so precise that even corrupt officials couldn't ignore them. Bank accounts frozen, properties seized. An empire built over 3 generations crumbled before sunset. On Wednesday, Vincent himself vanished. His wife received flowers with no card. His lawyers received silence. And the city understood that asking questions about Vincent Carleone's whereabouts was the same as volunteering to join him. Across Manhattan, journalists who'd been investigating Savino operations suddenly reassigned themselves to lighter stories. A crime reporter for The Times took an unexpected sabbatical. A detective known for his dogged pursuit of organized crime submitted early retirement papers, citing personal reasons that everyone understood meant survival. Even City Hall bent. The mayor, who'd publicly promised to crack down on organized crime, quietly redirected resources elsewhere. After all, violent crime statistics were down. The streets were safer. And if that safety came wrapped in fear of a name spoken only in whispers, well, results were results. New York slept easier. But it was the sleep of the threatened, the kind that came with one eye open and doors double locked. Amid the chaos, at 3:47 a.m. on a Thursday morning, Michelle's water broke. She'd been dreaming of fire when the first contraction seized her, sharp enough to steal her breath. Within minutes, Rodrigo's security team had her in the private elevator, rushing toward the medical clinic, 3 floors down a facility that officially didn't exist on any city records, but was equipped better than most hospitals. Rodrigo met them in the hallway, still in his shirt from yesterday's meetings, eyes bloodshot from nights spent orchestrating the Carleone collapse. But when he saw Michelle doubled over, gripping her belly, everything else ceased to matter. "I've got you," he said, his hand finding hers. "I'm right here." Dr. Reyes, a former trauma surgeon who'd worked in war zones before Rodrigo recruited her, assessed Michelle with efficient calm. 8 centimeters dilated. "We're moving fast. Let's get her to delivery." Outside, the city held its breath. Word had spread through the underworld that Savino's woman was in labor, that the boss himself was unreachable, focused on something beyond empires and vengeance. Some saw opportunity. Most saw warning. If anything happened during this vulnerable moment, the retaliation would be biblical. Rodrigo's men positioned themselves at every entrance, every stairwell, every possible point of access. The clinic became a fortress. Inside, Michelle screamed through contractions that felt like her body was tearing apart. Rodrigo stayed beside her through all of it. Silent, steady, his hand accepting the crushing grip of hers without flinching. He'd faced armed enemies, negotiated with killers, ordered deaths without hesitation. But watching Michelle fight through labor, watching her body work to bring life into a world he'd shaped with violence, humbled him in ways nothing else could. "You're doing beautifully," Dr. Reyes coached. "One more push. Come on, Michelle." Michelle bore down, her scream raw and primal, and then, a cry. Small, furious, alive. The sound filled the room like a prayer answered. "It's a girl," Dr. Reyes announced, laying the infant on Michelle's chest. Michelle sobbed, exhausted and overwhelmed, her hands trembling as they touched her daughter's impossibly small body. The baby's cries softened against her mother's heartbeat, instinct finding comfort. Rodrigo stared at them both, this woman who'd survived everything he'd brought into her life, and this child who would grow up under his protection. His chest tightened with something he didn't have words for. Dr. Reyes handed him surgical scissors. "Would you like to cut the cord?" He did, his hands steady despite the weight of the moment. This tiny person, 8 pounds of perfection and possibility, was now part of his world, part of him. When Michelle's exhaustion pulled her toward sleep, Rodrigo carefully lifted his daughter, cradling her with a tenderness that contradicted every rumor the city whispered about him. She was so small, so fragile, so completely dependent on him to keep the darkness away. He leaned close, his voice barely a whisper against her downy head. "It's a girl. She'll never know fear." The promise settled over them like a vow. The man who'd ruled through intimidation, who'd silenced a city through calculated violence, now held peace in his arms. And for the first time in 15 years since his mother's death had taught him that power without protection was meaningless, Rodrigo Savino understood what he'd been building toward. Not an empire. A family. 6 weeks after Isabella was born, La Bella Knot reopened its doors. The restaurant had changed hands quietly, paperwork filed through corporate shells and silent investments that led back to Savino Holdings, though no official records would ever prove it. The new management kept the original staff, raised their wages, and made it clear that certain tables were permanently reserved. Michelle stood behind the bar on opening morning, Isabella asleep in a carrier strapped to her chest. She'd healed in ways both visible and invisible, the bruises long faded, the fear finally lifting. Her body had recovered from childbirth. Her soul was learning what safety felt like when it wasn't temporary. The other staff moved around her with quiet reverence. They knew her story, or parts of it. Knew that the woman who once flinched at raised voices now stood protected by the most dangerous man in New York. That knowledge changed how they spoke to her, how they looked at her. She was no longer just Michelle the waitress. She was Michelle Savino's woman. And that meant something in this city. Across town, Rodrigo finished a meeting with his accountants, reviewing legitimate business holdings that had expanded significantly in recent months. The Carleone territory had been absorbed, their operations either legitimized or eliminated. The power vacuum had been filled so smoothly that most of the city barely noticed the transition. Violence had given way to structure, chaos to order. He checked his watch, 8:15 a.m. Michelle's first shift back started at 8. He'd promised to stop by, to see how she was managing with Isabella, though they both knew it was more than that. Some rituals needed completing. Some circles needed closing. When Rodrigo entered La Bella Knot, the morning sun slashed through the windows exactly as it had months ago, catching the tables in golden light. A handful of early customers looked up, then quickly looked away. His presence still commanded that response, respect laced with self-preservation. But Michelle didn't look away. She watched him cross the dining room, her daughter sleeping peacefully against her chest, and felt the weight of how far they'd traveled from that first moment of recognition. From bruises and fear to this, safety, family, a future that didn't include flinching. Rodrigo stopped beside the bar, his presence commanding yet somehow gentle. He looked at Isabella first, his expression softening in ways the city would never see. Then his eyes found Michelle's. "She's beautiful," he said quietly. "She's safe," Michelle corrected. "That's more important." Rodrigo reached across the bar, his hand covering hers, the same gesture that had begun everything months ago. His thumb traced the wrist where bruises used to circle, now healed and unmarked. "The city's quiet now," Michelle murmured, glancing toward the windows where Manhattan stretched endlessly. "It'll stay that way," Rodrigo replied, his voice carrying the weight of promise. "As long as you're safe." Michelle studied him, this man who'd destroyed enemies and rebuilt empires, all to protect a waitress he'd barely known. She understood now what the city had always known, that Rodrigo Savino's word was law, his protection absolute, his love as fierce and dangerous as the violence he wielded. Outside, faint sirens echoed through the streets, not warnings of danger, but reminders of the peace built on shadows. The kind of peace that required men like Rodrigo to stand in darkness so others could live in light. Dawn painted the skyline in shades of gold and amber. Michelle gazed out the window, one hand resting on her daughter's back, feeling the steady rhythm of Isabella's breath. She thought about the bruise that had started everything, those unmistakable marks circling her wrist that had caught the attention of the right man at exactly the right moment. That bruise had changed everything. It had silenced a city, reshaped an underworld, created a family from violence and protection. Michelle looked back at Rodrigo, saw the future written in his dark eyes. Not perfect, never simple, but safe. And sometimes, for women who'd lived in fear, safety was the greatest love story of all. "Thank you," she whispered. Rodrigo squeezed her hand. "Always." The restaurant filled slowly with morning light, and in that moment, Michelle understood that some salvation came wrapped in expensive suits and tattoos, that sometimes the most dangerous man in the city was also the safest place to stand. And that love, when it finally came, wore whatever armor it needed to keep you breathing. And just like that, the story fades, but the message remains. If it touched you, inspired you, or reminded you of something real, hit subscribe, like, and tell me in the comments how it made you feel. Every click, every comment, every listener, you are part of this storytelling family now. Until the next story, may your heart stay open and your soul stay gentle.